The second day of the DEF CON Voting Village speaker track. We're going to start out today with Professor Martha Mahoney, Professor of Law at the University of Miami and Distinguished Dean's Scholar there. And she is going to talk to us about regulatory failure having to do with ballot marking devices. Take it away, Martha.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, it's perfect. Okay, thank you. So my title is a recipe for distrust, because I'm concerned not only about the security problems and the voter interacting with the machine before they interact with the ballot and the other things about ballot marking devices, but also the urgent need to have trustworthy equipment and the ability to show the public it was trustworthy. I'll address verifiability and accuracy, but as much as possible, the need for reliable public assurance. And as I worked on this talk, as you'll see toward the end, I shifted a little in thinking about things that aren't being drafted well enough now. How should we approach it? So literally doing the research for this summer, I am slightly shifting, and you'll hear why. That is, I'm shifting away from what we call in law a standard to thinking we may need some bright line rules to clarify things. A significant number of people don't trust election results. Other people here have probably said that too, but when I'm thinking about distrust and these systems, that's really important. In 2024, I was looking for recent result polls. So as of 2024, a poll by the Washington Post found about a third of Americans believed the 2020 election had been unfair or rigged, despite the lack of legal evidence ever being produced. If someone cannot win at this point, they may have the goal of delegitimizing the election in which they lost. And when we're thinking about regulating them and the issues that have come up during regulating these, that means it's damaging to this distrust that's produced is damaging to election officials, the public generally, and voters. Consistently producing evidence that supports the correct outcome, risk-limiting audits, which we heard about yesterday from Philip Stark, they're essential. But those require a trustworthy record to base the audit on, which is one of the crucial questions for ballot marking devices. Ballot marking devices, and this is in my subtitle, are problematic both in the unreadable record of the vote that's produced on them and in the creation of multiple images of what the voter used. So I was going to go up to slide 9. Oops. There's your ES&S sample ballot that's incorporated into the Florida rule on elections on ballots. It really looks simple to remember that. It looks simple partly because it's a sample ballot for a third party that ran few offices in that sample primary. Actual primary ballots are much more complicated, and most other ballots are more complicated. That's the Florida record. I will come back to it and go back to my beginning. So my first question is, how did we get here? The more I started thinking about writing this paper, and I've been concerned about the issue since ballot marking devices were being deployed, and especially when they were required for all voters in some states. How did we wind up here? The fundamental, when I say they're underregulated, I want to say, I don't believe as a law professor that this is one where we just need to layer in more regulation on this system, and I'll say why. The flaws are fundamental. So that's the image of the purported sample ballot that you just saw, and it looks misleadingly simple because it was produced for that form and purports to be a Green Party primary in a locality where they're only running 3 contests. The QR codes that are used in the Dominion system in Georgia are different. This is the barcode version that I showed you. The other ballots have QR codes and also a list. We're going to talk about the lists, but I want to start with the codes and why we would ever have accepted them. It matters because changing systems is so much more difficult. Challenging them and changing them is so much more difficult after they've been certified, purchased with huge amounts of public money and deployed. Those decisions that were made by officials, they're going to want to defend them both because of the spending and if they say there's going to be an additional cost to replace them and the wisdom of those decisions. On all those grounds, they are likely to defend them vigorously. And legally, effort to change that decision that those decision makers chose, it will run into legal obstacles like standing and statutes of limitations, which have affected codes. Code challenges in the Georgia case and other cases. And also, judges seriously consider their judicial role. They're actually supposed to. And getting an order to change systems off DREs was an exceptional decision in Georgia, but judges are supposed to say, if the law gives this to the Secretary of State or the legislature, then I have to think very hard about my judicial role. And that makes it harder too, because judges won't that quickly order any change in a system. Everything is harder once they were adopted, and I'm saying the flaws should have been obvious, and I am about to show you 3. I hope they are entertaining illustrations of why it should have been obvious. You already probably saw one go by. So in Florida, there's an audit, an ability to have an automated independent audit. That's clear ballot in Florida. And this is what the regulation says. It says it must be completely independent of any voting system certified in Florida and not have any proprietary election-related software or hardware. However, information used to decode the ballot artwork, take that phrase, what I'm talking about right now is ballot artwork, beautifully defined in this Florida rule, and barcoding schemes on ballots may be shared from the primary vote tabulation to the automatic audit. Well, that means they're counting from the same ballot artwork interpretation code. Right. That does things to the audit itself, obviously, the independent automated audit. It's really checking if it will read the code the same way the primary system in place read the code using the same information. But what I want to look at is this concept of ballot artwork. Because reading that, I thought, if the voters thought, I am getting encoded artwork, I don't know if they would have felt as comfortable. QR codes and barcodes are ubiquitous, and I'm about to describe what's problematic about them. But they're everywhere, and they seem to get our packages delivered, and they seem to connect people to the internet. I had to do that to get a cab. My excellent research assistant working on this said, but I scan QR codes all the time. They have achieved a kind of universality that gives the impression that they are consistently going to do something, which I'm hoping to help you see would not necessarily be the conclusion. I think it's a cultural artifact of this period that those codes became so widely accepted without critical reflection. But we, that is, there's people in this room who have seen the problems from the beginning. But we, the societal collective we, election officials and legislators and voters, we should have been able to see the problems better. So here's an example. Oh gosh, it's absurd. This is the opposite of a proposal. It would be an absolutely dreadful idea. But I thought, imagine if the ballot artwork wasn't in the common form of QR and barcodes, but instead was in something that's also inscrutable, encoded. They aren't encrypted anyway in those QR codes, according to Alex Halderman's report on the Dominion system, encoded in something inscrutable and more colorful. Sorry. It's all artwork. And there's your more colorful code. Now, if we gave that to a voter, it's encoded, okay, so I used Unicode emojis, chosen whimsically because random is a serious concept. I didn't nearly approach it. And because I really know pretty much nothing except having read the code breakers longer ago than I even want to try to count. There's a couple of null characters and one or two tiny wrinkles, but that is a very simple substitution code. But if you handed it to a voter and said, there, this is fine, there's the names of the 3 candidates right under it. No, there's something cultural about our acceptance of QR codes and barcodes that didn't let us see that this was basically encoded artwork with a list. That's my point 1 on that. Point 2, well, barcodes are artwork too. Seriously, they're more pixels and ink on paper or whatever they are. But Kroger's got in trouble recently when Consumer Reports figured out that they had been ringing up things widely at the cash register that differed from the listed price. In grocery stores and other stores, many people are aware that the codes don't always show what the listed price said they would show. North Carolina this year, that's my little headline, fined 14 companies which had made repeated problems of scanning things up at higher prices. Vigilant shoppers know that. People sometimes know. My best friend is a vigilant shopper. I'm a spacey shopper. If she watches what's being rung up, or people can look at their receipts, they can see if the price is not what's listed. But a lot of people know that just because the list says so, it isn't in the barcode going to come out that way. It's more dangerous in the ballot. Because when you ring out at the cash register, you can watch the screen and you will get a receipt. You don't get any receipt or any visible evidence. The voter doesn't see anything as you get rung up, as it were, when the vote is tabulated. So this is a more impenetrable system than a system that people know day to day doesn't always show what it says. My final example is actually my favorite and the point of this talk in a way. A better analogy for barcodes, I think, is invisible ink. If we gave a voter a ballot and said, here's a great new high-tech ballot. It's invisible ink that's so secure. And here's the list on the same page or the other side of the ballot. Here's a list that shows you what's written in invisible ink, and it will go in the scanner that will light up the code, and it will save a picture of that. It will save an image and count the vote, which may or may not be used later in this election process, which we won't bother to explain to you. I don't think anyone would have accepted emojis. Nobody would have wanted invisible ink. That is, it would have been more transparent to the voter that this was ballot artwork and a list. The relationship between the art and the list is a whole lot of what I'll be talking about today. But first I want to say a whole lot of people did see this problem. Georgia's adoption of statewide DREs was contested at the time. The only cybersecurity expert on the committee that made recommendations, Dr. Lee, was fiercely against it for cybersecurity and other reasons. Coalition for Good Governance was speaking up against it, and some legislators spoke up against it, and it went through anyway. It's not that no one contested it. It is that there was a widespread and effective, unfortunately, acceptance of a system that should never have been put in place. So next question, the printed text lists on the ballot. Several studies have shown that voters don't always review the printed lists on the ballots, even when they're prompted to do so. So there's a study from Sevierville, Tennessee, that showed of 87 voters, 46 reviewed their ballot summaries, and 51 did not. And the ballots contained 18 contests, and the average time spent reviewing was 3.9 seconds. Minimum time was 1 second for people who did review the ballot. That really seems to me a glance at the top contest, at most. And the maximum time was 19 seconds. When they were asked about whether a ballot they're being shown in a post-election question was the same ballot, there were false positives and other mistakes. There was a study in Ann Arbor, Michigan, of the same question set up like a sample election. Of the 44 voters, this bothers me, of the 44 voters who saw the errors, more than 10% blamed themselves. They didn't say, oh, this is definitely wrong. They said, maybe I'm misremembering, or I might have made a mistake, when shown a ballot that actually had an altered item on the list. It bothers me that voters blame themselves partly because it makes it less likely that it will be actually effectively reported, but even reporting it, as I'll say, won't bring about any solution. So 1 more minute. Oh, so back to this for 1 second. That's the 3 separate images. And I'll read you later in a little bit from some elections that went bad, things showing that any of those could cause a problem or a discrepancy. So by introducing 3 multiple images, I believe we've multiplied our opportunities for conflict and distrust to develop. More on that 3 of them later. That's the one you saw before. There, thanks, I'm sorry. Well, the barcodes are what's being counted from in this image. I'm sorry, I should have said it when I put it up, thank you. And the list is what's beside it. And the legal, well, when I started thinking about this, I was thinking, well, one of these should be chosen to be authoritative. The phrase ballot of record is often used in, not even all that often when I looked for it, but it's not always defined. And if you tried to pick one of these 3, I will explain why I don't think we could pick one of these 3. And there are computer scientists who've been saying that for a while. But the systems count from the codes, and then there is also a list, which in some states will be used in the event of a manual recount, but I'll explain why that won't help much either. Inconsistencies occurring in different forms. In DeKalb County, when the ultimately winning candidate had gotten no votes in many, many precincts, the problem was attributed to programming for the scanner, where these are printed like this and then slid into the precinct scanner. And the hand count was made from the printed lists, which I assume were determined to be correct. In another example, in Northampton County in 2019, no votes were recorded for a judicial candidate. That was attributed to human error formatting the ballot, so they were able to count from paper. But a later error in the same county, it was wrong both in the machine and on the paper. So the paper was incorrect. So it is not true the list will always be correct. It is not true that the programming will always be correct. It was not even true the scanner would always be correct. When that's the situation, I think it makes it much more difficult to say any of those should be chosen as the ballot to be used authoritatively. Any of the 3 could be wrong. And those are just problems that were detected, which were usually because of extremely disproportionate results or very evident errors. That's the current list. We're talking about functionality of reading a list. That's from Palm Beach County, which is now, because Florida changed its rule and made these available if the county wants to use them for all voters instead of for accommodation. That's the list from a Palm Beach County precinct that was not chosen. I had to type it up because I don't have a voted list from it, but I did get a copy of the ballot, so that reflects the sample ballot. That reflects the actual one. I think there was a swath in the middle of Palm Beach County that was electing 2 seats on the Port of Palm Beach Commission that would have gotten me even 1 or 2 more lines, but that's representative. Frequently, there are 23, 24, 25 choices. When voters look at it, it's in a different format. It's not laid out the way they encountered the ballot. It's laid out like that. And if anyone thinks that judicial is somewhere else in my notes, but if anyone thinks that retain a justice of the Supreme Court is a down ballot, it is down ballot. And sometimes people skip them. But the Wisconsin Supreme Court case this year ran over $100 million, broke records, and made national headlines. Judicial races, which were once seen as, oh yes, down the ballot, have been making national headlines sometimes. All of them are important. The sheriff's important. The supervisor of elections is important. The things we're voting for are very important, and that list is too long to be functional for many reasons, not least that it's so different from the ways in which the ballots were cast. Okay. When it doesn't say party in the Florida system, it was a nonpartisan vote. The more deep problem that I mentioned, and it is one, is that all claims about discrepancies are not verifiable. So if a voter does see a discrepancy, and remember there were false positives, false negatives in that study, but if a voter does see a discrepancy, somebody let me know on time. I should have checked when we started timing. Someone in the back give me a signal when I've got 6 minutes left. I have a lot to cover. There's a lot of reasons that it could have come out. The voter could be correct about the discrepancy. The voter could have actually made a mistake, and so on. The voter could have been incorrect and made input that's wrong, but the voter's claim about a discrepancy could also be false. Honestly, the fact that it's not verifiably true or false is very problematic, because that means we really can't treat this list as authoritative either. And that is explained in the excellent article, Why Ballot Marking Devices Cannot Assure the Will of the Voters and Other Things. But I want you to remember that the count stopped in Miami-Dade, Florida in 2000, not because of a Supreme Court order, but because of what Wikipedia calls the Brooks Brothers riot. Demonstration, the county attorney says, we can't count over that noise, we can't meet the deadline if we can't count now, stop counting. That's when it stopped. Disruption in the precinct, if there are false reports, would be serious. Disruption from true reports would be serious, and you can't prove either way which one it was. My initial impulse to like a human readable list diminished the further I looked into this. So why I say they're not well regulated, I mentioned this before. There's other problems besides not saying what's the authoritative ballot. If you make the printed list authoritative in a hand recount, they often are looked at only in a tiny fraction of elections. So you're actually counting from something else and then saying the printed list will govern, but looking at the printed list is a serious question in its own right and not functional for voters. Georgia, when reviewing in a recount, only looks for overvotes. Florida looks for overvotes and undervotes. The real definition is that the machine is reporting it can't read a mark, or that it reads too many marks, though it's usually defined as the voter made too many marks. At any rate, it will only seldom happen. I want to go back to why we should have known and ask if we should have known what these were like, and those are potential conflicts. What should we know now? What's going to happen next, or seems to be happening now? What is it that I will say later we should have known at this point? What seems to be happening is proposals or a recently certified system under the Voluntary Guidelines 2.0 that don't have codes, but they have that long printed list that's human readable. The recent executive order has political significance, and it says get rid of codes and do human readable. That's also being proposed, at least in Georgia. Still keeping a computer between the voter and their vote. So I want to give you the 7-word opening to the conclusion of my paper, which I'll have all of 2 or 3 minutes to give you. Human readability is necessary but not sufficient. Human readability as a standard is necessary but not sufficient because those lists aren't really functional and may still contain errors that may still go undetected, and they're continuing this problem that Alex Halderman has a nice popular quote here from PBS. Anytime that you're going to put a potentially vulnerable computer between the voter and the only records of their vote, you can have problems. So if you say human readability is the standard, I'm saying that's what we should know now is not enough. That's what we should be clarifying. I see a trend to turn to it. It's understandable to turn to it, and it's not a good answer. When I was writing this, I was thinking that what I wanted to do was create a legal standard based on strong software independence. I'm influenced by the excellent paper I mentioned before on the idea that systems also need contestability, the ability to show that something went wrong, and defensibility, the ability to restore it. And it matters who notices it and whether they can show what they noticed and so on. But when you look at that, and I might take the time to read it if I come back, It's hard to translate into a legal standard. I am impressed that Florida expanded access to the machines by counting them as marked sense ballots, which we already required, and sliding them through. And there is no separate report on how many are now being counted from ballot marking devices called voter interface devices in Florida, creating marked sense ballots. Why? Because marked sense and optical scan are interchangeable terms, and they are in fact sliding through an optical scanner. But if that's how this can work, I don't want to give you a draft law. I will spend just a couple of moments on things that are important to think about as we draft laws more clearly. But because of reinterpretation and the danger that standards might be general enough to be reinterpreted, I think we're going to have to move to more bright line rules and specificity and think about how to write them. So this will take, as Philip Stark said yesterday, states are saying they do risk limiting audits when that is not what they are doing. They are using the name for what he called security theater, a good term. One of the things we have to think about is time. A risk limiting auditor may expand, thank you, David, may expand. And right now, some states have very short deadlines. The third largest state, Florida, has the 7th shortest deadline, 2 weeks. Why? Because the Constitution says the state legislature must be seated in 2 weeks. So they now are required to be certified on the morning of the 14th day when the legislature has to sit down. But that is driving a system in which Florida seems to keep making decisions in fear that the certification deadline would be expanded. That's not the only state with that kind of issue. We need to have time and think about it. Texas, California, and New York, the other largest states, all have much longer deadlines. And these things may take time. That's my short form. I am still thinking because my research, what happens sometimes when you do research is you wind up with a somewhat different conclusion than you originally thought. I thought I would bring you not a model law. We do need some examples of good laws. In law, writing a model law is a long process. I'm saying we need good examples of how these should be. My thinking is changing, and I'm just going to say this one more time because one of the excellent experienced people in the room told me I could say it 3 times. Human readability is necessary but not sufficient, and I think that's the phase we're headed into, and thank you for listening.